Hello. Well, we've been talking about the trouble with scope control. And as soon as we start talking about controlling something, it's reasonable to ask ourselves, what are we controlling to? And in the last video, when we were talking about scope control, I did mention several times the turnaround premise. The turnaround premise is the guidance that we will use to set up our scope control process. So it never ceases to amaze me if I'm invited in to help a team get a better handle on scope control, and the first thing I discover is, oh well, we don't really bother with a turnaround premise, or we don't believe in a turnaround premise, or anything along that line. We can't have a conversation about scope control unless we have a conversation about setting the control point. And that is the point of a turnaround premise. Scope control begins here, right? It's not, there's sometimes some misunderstandings out there. This isn't some kind of window dressing document. This isn't some general guideline or wish list or anything like that. It isn't even like a proclamation document like a mission and vision statement. This is an actual control document. It is the beginning of our scope control process. The premise is going to dictate what we will control the scope to, and it's also going to dictate what our scope challenge will challenge the scope to. So that makes it obvious that we should involve all of the stakeholders that are going to be a part of this turnaround event, because we need everybody's input, because we do not want to create a turnaround premise that is really just a series of exceptions to itself. So the turnaround premise needs to involve all of the stakeholders. So every turnaround premise should clarify one thing right at the start: the prime directive. And the prime directive for any turnaround is we are only going to accept the scope that requires the facility to be in shutdown in order to execute. And we're going to look at all of our scope that comes up. We're going to look at our regulatory inspections. We're going to look at our process cleaning. We're going to look at project execution. Nothing comes into the turnaround automatically, right? Even regulatory inspection. People often are saying, well, all regulatory inspection is part of the turnaround. Well, no, if I don't need to take the facility down to complete that inspection, then I'm not going to put it in my turnaround. So that needs to be your prime directive for any meaningful turnaround premise. Now, there are times when you're going to want to do some work that's wildly outside of the prime directive. And when you do that, that should be detailed into the premise in great detail, because we are swimming upstream against best practice here, and we don't want to open the door to a flood. So let's narrowly define whatever that exception we feel is necessary to have. Let's include that in our premise. The premise needs to be detailed, and it needs to be specific. This is not the time to, practice our flowery talking in generality speech. Once the premise is approved, we need to think of it the same way the military thinks of rules of engagement. So as soon as I say that, that makes it clear that the realistic KPI for your turnaround premise is 0 exceptions, right? So if we find ourselves having to approve one exception after another exception, if you're sitting up on the strategy team, you're vice president, senior vice president, and you keep getting these exception requests coming to you, that's a pretty strong indication that the turnaround premise was developed wrong, right? I'm not even gonna, pamper it down and call it poorly or inadequately. It was just plain done wrong, right? You shouldn't be seeing that. So this is where we can help, Creating these kind of things, the reason why turnaround premises are often kind of a mess is anytime we try to sit down at a board table with a dozen or a dozen and a half or 2 dozen different stakeholders and come to a consensus agreement on something, let's face it, we all know that's a challenge. So facilitation can help in those instances. Your Advando Senior Advisor is an excellent person to help facilitate this kind of thing. If you happen to have a senior advisor with us on a subscription service agreement, they're coming in 2 or 3 days a month or a week a month, then, helping facilitate something like your turnaround premise just becomes part of the ROI on that advisor contract. So that's what I have to say about the turnaround premise. And the last part of this series we're going to talk about is Scope Challenge itself. So for now, peace out.